Okay, well, we'd like to start off just by asking you if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your history and your career in the history of science.
Well, I started off as a naive freshman, first year student, and thinking that I would go into science because, I grew up in a time when science was being very much encouraged in the early 60s and 70s. And so when I finished high school, I assumed I would go into science, and I got very interested in chemistry and was just about to declare as a chemistry major when I took a history of science course, a history of ancient Greek science. And I thought, history of science, what could that be? Science has a history? What would that mean? And at that time it meant something like, following how science today emerged, from the Greeks through the Middle Ages, through the Renaissance, through the scientific revolution. So it was very much a kind of history of philosophy story, history of ideas story, history of theory story. And when I went to write my senior thesis, which I happened to live in Australia for very odd reasons then, but that's where I was going to college, and so we all wrote very extensive senior theses, actually. Well, there weren't very many of us, but in history of science at that time. And I wrote a thesis. I wanted to write a thesis on the early Royal Society. And I had started reading the Philosophical Transactions, and I was so interested in all of the reports of monsters and, monstrous births and so on. And I thought, this is what I wanted to write my thesis on. But my advisor, who was a historian of philosophy, said, that's kind of odd. I think you should write on the early mathematics, the history of mathematics in the early Royal Society. So a much more conventional kind of, story of how modern science came into being. But for my dissertation then, when I then went to graduate school in the History of Science department at Johns Hopkins, I went back to that, and I became interested in, especially in Paracelsus, but in the history of alchemy, and kind of going back to my interest in history of chemistry, and wrote my dissertation on a German, 17th century German, Johann Becher, who was both an economic writer and an chemical writer. So I tried to show how those two things overlapped, and in fact they overlapped in very interesting ways. And so when I started teaching, my goal was really to tell a history of the scientific revolution in a way that would take account of and encompass those monsters and monstrous births that the early members of the early Royal Society were so interested in. And also to take account of alchemy, which of course, there's been an enormous work now on the history of alchemy, which shows just how much those members of the early Royal Society were interested in alchemy. Also, obviously, Newton to start with, Robert Boyle, etc. So I began teaching a course, Alchemy, Magic, and Science, which was a kind of inverted history of science or scientific revolution course, in which I showed the way, not how modern science came into being, but how, as the new philosophy, came to be proclaimed, and new scientific societies came to be founded, that there were areas that had been really, really central to the study of nature. Alchemy, astrology, really at the center of the study of nature, and they were excluded from the new philosophy. So to tell the story of how pseudoscience, the concept of pseudoscience came into being, was kind of my goal, to show how the margins mattered, really. The things that we marginalize today mattered in terms of the history of this new emerging concept of, experimental philosophy and then modern science. So then after I wanted to continue with alchemy, but I really was interested in Paracelsus. I wanted to go back to Paracelsus. And I realized that the kinds of, Paracelsus was a early 16th century, late 15th century, early 16th century a reformer of medicine, which is how he's probably best known, but also very much a religious reformer. Not all that much has been published on his ideas there. But what was really interesting to me were his writings on craftspeople, and especially on, for example, the diseases of miners. He was the first really to write on diseases of miners, and he really went to the mines. There was, in his lifetime, there was a real boom in especially silver mining in different German principalities, and Paracelsus went and studied the miners, talked to them as far as we know. I mean, this is what he describes doing, and the evidence of his texts is that, in fact, he did, recorded a lot of their remedies for their illnesses, which were many, because they were working, with mercury and all kinds of noxious fumes. And so I really was interested in what did Paracelsus take away from that experience of talking to craftspeople and studying miners in situ, so to speak. And it seems like, what I then argued in my next project on art and experience is that he really took away an epistemology of how to get knowledge about nature, and what I called an artisanal or craft epistemology. Right. So the way in which craftspeople thought about how they got knowledge of nature, the kind of claims that they made in terms of how their knowledge was based on nature, was kind of based on an immediate experience of nature, and that was a kind of certain knowledge that was as certain as abstract knowledge like geometry or other kinds of models of abstract knowledge, and just how important that was both for the way in which the claims about how to get a more certain kind of knowledge emerged in the late 16th and 17th centuries. So his ideas were very much picked up. His ideas, but other ideas about practice also. There's a huge kind of expansion of interest in practice, practical techniques, the concept of practice, on the part of not only Paracelsus, but also, city governments who were interested in, increasing the productivity of their crafts, of the commodities that went out from their cities, on the part of princes who needed fortifications built, and on the part of humanists interested in ideas of practice as opposed to more abstract knowledge, or as opposed to other kinds of study. And so that, along with the craft, the interest in the crafts on the part of people like Paracelsus and the dissemination of his works, meant that became a very important, component of the new philosophy, the kinds of claims about new philosophy, that it wasn't just about theory, it wasn't just about abstractions, it wasn't just about claims, but it was actually about producing things.
So this example of Paracelsus, is that, would you term it as local science, local knowledge?
I would say that the miners' ideas about nature and about how they transformed metals and about how metals grew in the earth, or the way in which they were generated from in the ground, I would say that's local knowledge. And through Paracelsus and others, especially Georgius Agricola then, the great writer on mining and mining practices and ideas of metals in the 16th century, mid and late 16th century, that through their writings new theories emerged, but these theories were very much, which then were disseminated in a larger movement, across learned society throughout Europe, and actually across the Atlantic also, because of course silver mining was extremely important also in the New World. And so, that's a perfect example of knowledge in motion.
Right.
Which is
the
which
theme for the
is-
unit.
right, which is that these miners' ideas about how metals transformed under the earth and how to find them. Right, in mining, you have to decide from the surface, where do you dig? Right, the science of prospecting. I mean, we could call that a science of prospecting or the practice of prospecting. That those are very local practices. Which then are codified in Paracelsus's and Georgius Agricola's writings, which are then disseminated. And the codification itself means that they take on a new status and are able to move more easily and become the more authoritative and, sometimes considered universal knowledge of science.
So how does this knowledge, you're using the mining example, how does this knowledge move around these routes in the forms of people or written communication or objects?
In terms of craft knowledge, there seems to, there was a belief and a practice, it goes back probably to ancient times of trying to find things with some sort of rod. Usually at least in Europe, it's a willow rod. And it can be forked, and you hold it, and when you get to ore or water in the hands of an experienced dowser, it moves, and you dig there, right? So this continued to be used, actually, and taught in the mining academy at Freiberg into the 18th century, into the late 18th century. So it was a practice, and it required skill. It required a experienced miner. So, you have to think about what is it exactly. It's a kind of codification of knowledge, and let me explain what I mean by that. That an experienced miner would have had experience with what does the landscape look like. For example, if you think about how does any prospecting happen, it happens because you look for rock outcrops, you look for pieces of ore that have maybe broken off and been washed into streams, and so you are hyper vigilant, as you look at the landscape for the signs of ore. But the problem is you have to decide where to dig. The capital-intensive, labor-intensive process of digging in order to see if something's there. So a dowsing stick is a kind of codification of that knowledge, right? It tells you where to take action. That kind of knowledge, however, can really only move in people, in the sense that you have to have an experienced person. If you're going to have another experienced person, they really have to be an apprentice, and learn where to look and so on. So people, knowledge moves in people.
Okay.
And especially craft knowledge, which is often tacit, it can't be written down, because, think about how would you actually describe how to do dowsing, right? You have to look out for all of these different things. You have to feel in some way the dowsing stick. You have to concentrate your, both powers of observation as well as, pay attention to what's happening with the stick. So there's a kind of a description, which is of the process, of the practice, which would be exceedingly tedious to write down. And this is something that, scientists still say, that if you try to write down every single action that you're doing in a lab, it's going to be impossible to read, basically. So, tacit knowledge. So, knowledge moves in people, but obviously the books not only allowed knowledge to move faster, but also gave it a certain status. Because, of course, in European culture, written knowledge has a higher status than tacit knowledge, knowledge that's in the hands or in the body, embodied knowledge. So that's how it moves. It can also move in things like recipe books, so what we call how-to manuals, and these you see a real increase in that kind of writing down of technical knowledge from about 1400 on in Europe. So there's, that's part of the interest in practice. People wanted to know how their objects worked or how their objects were made, but also we don't know exactly who read all those how-to manuals, and a lot of them don't actually describe how to do something. So knowledge can move in people, in books, in practices and descriptions of practices to a certain extent. Usually it has to be accompanied by a person, and this is still true of science today, that if you have, a lab process, sociologists of science have shown that in fact it can't be replicated at another lab, that you have to actually send the people in order to replicate the experiment. Or knowledge can move in objects and in materials.
Mm-hmm.
But if it moves in objects, you usually have to have a person who knows how that object is made. But that's now what museum scholars do, which is to try and figure out how were these objects made. What can we learn about those techniques by kind of not retrofitting. What is the right word? When you try to reenact the processes by which this thing was made. Yeah.
Could you possibly give us an example of the routes that you're talking about, how this knowledge, these objects, these people traveled around the world?
And how are those routes sort of shaped by the changing political dynamics of Europe in the times that you study?
So I would say that, when you think about the movement of knowledge, you mainly think about geography or movement across space. But I think that some of the most important routes were actually, in terms of, say, the mining knowledge that I'm talking about, just to begin with, that those routes, I would call them epistemic routes.
Okay.
That's roots, R-O-U-T-E-S, right? The epistemic movement of knowledge. And what I mean by that is the movement from, like the miners to people like Georgius Agricola, who was a mining shareholder. Well, first of all, he was a physician, and he was a city physician. But then he was also a shareholder in mines. And he was clearly also writing his books on mining for other shareholders, so they understood how mining worked and whether it was a risky investment or not. So it's that movement from the embodied, tacit, unwritten knowledge practice of craftspeople up to or across to another social group, another social level. And this movement of knowledge can sometimes be more important than the geographical movement of knowledge. So across, social distance rather than across physical distance. But Europe in this period was sending out ships and, conquering trying to conquer different parts of the world, trying to take over certain trading routes. And in doing so, they were very interested in trying to figure out not only where gold and silver were located, but also trying to figure out whether all of these new plants and animals and different substances that they were finding could either substitute for materials that were used in Europe, or could, be new sources, especially of medicinal healing. So, if you think about the kinds of things that were brought back that were considered very, very promising, say from North America, North and Central America, the bark of the guaiacum bark, was called Jesuit's bark, as a cure for syphilis. Syphilis was a new disease called the French disease, if it's in fact what we think it is, syphilis. And the main cure for it at the time in the late 15th century, when it first arose in Europe, was mercury, actually taking large amounts of mercury. And so this new bark was very promising, was seen as a very promising way to cure it. And so, that's an example, of substances which give rise to new knowledge across distance.
Would you say that this movement of knowledge was driven by the promise of monetary gain?
I would say that there was always a commercial
Right.
idea in mind, but that necessitated. I mean, is there always a commercial gain for medicinal, substances?
Right.
Yes, but there's also an interest in the greater knowledge. I mean, the scholars who went out to or who wrote about the substances being brought back, say some of the Spanish writers, for example, they were scholars. They were interested in these things in terms of how could they heal, how would they change medicine, but the territorial princes and nobles who sent out the ships, and the merchants who sent out the ships, and it was always this kind of partnership between the territorial princes and the merchants to begin with, were interested definitely in gain. Yeah. So, and I think that, in some ways, in terms of what I said before about history of science coming out of the history of ideas and the history of philosophy, meant for a long time that people didn't even think about the commercial aspects involved in the history of the emergence of modern science, although, of course, modern science has all kinds of commercial dimensions now. So it's interesting to see how that aspect of, what used to be called the voyages of exploration,
Right.
Have that the commercial aspect has really come to the fore in the history of science now. So we have colonial botany, for example, and all kinds of studies on the commercial aspects of early modern science.
When did that change start to happen in the field? Sort of what triggered that transition?
Well, I would say that it was triggered by, that's an interesting question. And I think that what happened in the history of early modern science, and I think I can say that it happened, in the time between I was an undergraduate and by the time I graduated from, finished my PhD, is that cultural history arrived. I mean, the new cultural history of the 1980s. And that was huge in the U.S., in the historical profession, as well as in history of science. And we all began busily writing microhistories. Microhistories of, particular individuals. In some ways, I can see my work on Becher as being one of those. What was he actually doing when he was doing alchemy or writing about alchemy? What was he actually proposing when he was writing about, economics or how an economy would work? And he definitely was not thinking in terms of the history of ideas, as it was told. So what was he doing? So there are many, many, stories, micro-histories written at that in the 80s and early 90s. And that really showed just how broad the history of science, what did science mean?
Right.
How broad the history of science could be if you could involve, if you could study people who were alchemists, people who were craftspeople, women healers, all kinds of what were called charlatans by both the physicians and later historians. So, what do we do with all those people if we include them in the history of science? And so people began to try and figure out, so, no one called it science really at the time in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. Although Deborah Harkness has now shown us that, in fact, people did call it science, that there were all kinds of people saying science, and they meant all kinds of things by it, including kind of craft knowledge and vernacular knowledge. But they didn't mean it in terms of the way that we talk about science today. So what did they do? Well, they were doing natural philosophy, but no, that was actually something that was done in the universities. I mean, that was a discipline in the universities. So it's clear that, many of these people were not at university, had never been trained at university. So how were they thinking about natural knowledge? So then really I think that historians began to talk not about the history of science, but about the history of natural knowledge. And how did that become an authority in the early modern period? And that's really what happened, is that natural knowledge, we think of science as such an authority. And when I was an undergraduate and just discovering history of science, I thought, oh, but science is an authority, right? And people must have always thought of it that way. But no, its authority was actually developed, by making claims about what it could do, and those claims being developed, and new methods of gaining knowledge being developed as a result of those claims. And so that emergence of natural knowledge as an authority came to be, I think, what the science of, the scientific revolution, if you want to say there was a revolution, which, obviously I'm sure you've talked about this in your class, but if it's a revolution, it's a very long-term one, and I don't really think we can talk about revolutions in those really extended time periods. But the part that I think is new is the kinds of claims that are being made for the knowledge of nature in early modern Europe at that specific time. 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, and then, it really emerges as an authority. It then takes on all of the kinds of aspects of authoritative knowledge. It begins to be done at university. Right. It becomes a university subject. You get the word science. You get people who are scientists in the early 19th century. You don't, of course, have any word for people who do natural knowledge before that. You have a whole, panoply of people, physicians, craftspeople, etc., but not people who self-identify as scientists until the early 19th century.
Can we use this lens, this global history lens, to look at the 19th and 20th centuries as well?
Absolutely. I think that's clear.
Yeah.
I mean, globalization has only increased the movement of knowledge, of information, the speed has increased greatly. But I think it's important to remember that those processes were already in operation, much earlier. In the Middle Ages, in the early modern period, certainly.
I guess our last question would be, do you have any fun stories from your research and archives, or anything that's a good example of knowledge in motion?
Well, so I started a few years ago trying to understand. After I finished my last book, I decided that, I understood how these artists and artisans, craftspeople were making claims about their knowledge and their claims to knowledge of nature. What I realized I didn't really do in that book was to try to figure out how did they think of, what was their view of nature? Like, how did they think what was the processes by which they thought they could manipulate natural materials to make something? And so I began looking at their writings and accounts of practices, and I came up with, what I think is, at least for miners and metalworkers, a kind of knowledge system by which they oriented their practices, which makes sense. I mean, a kind of logic of their natural, their understanding of nature. But little by little, I realized all of what I'm doing is written. All of what I'm studying is written. These are documents, right? But yet, craft is an embodied knowledge. Mm-hmm. So how do we get at the embodied elements of it? And so I decided to take a recipe book that is technical recipes, a list, collection of technical recipes, one of these what have been called how-to books, or they're also sometimes called books of secrets. I mean, books of secrets is a category. I mean, there were many books of secrets in the 16th century, beginning in the 16th century, and only increasing through the 18th century. These books of secrets were really books of collections of techniques. I mean, secret really meant technique.
Right.
I mean, it had all kinds of wonderful connotations of secrecy and mystery and so on. But so what I did was decide that I needed to see if I could, kind of become an apprentice and figure out and try to figure out, these techniques. And so, I guess this is knowledge in motion in one sense, in the sense that, here are these books which I'm trying to, from the past, from the 1500s, that I'm trying to, have come down to us, which are pretty obscure. It's very hard to know what materials they're using, how do these processes actually work? Are these actually meant to be used, these texts? So I worked with a conservator and practicing silversmith, and recreated some of these, or reenacted, reconstructed some of the casting processes that were in a late 16th century manuscript, which had never been studied. And so we did all kinds of experiments, and it actually gave me all kinds of insight into not just the techniques and the materials, but the, what it meant to write this down. So actually, what was it that a craftsperson was trying to do by writing down the techniques?
Yeah.
Like, why were they doing it? So that's another, and also just how local this knowledge actually is. I mean, that the practices are much more universal, if you want to call them universal. And what that has made, or at least generalizable, and what that has made me realize is that first of all, practices may be able to travel, and that those practices may be able to travel more widely than I thought. And that's because I think that those practices actually are shaped by the materials themselves, right? Materials have certain properties which foster certain skills. And those skills, you say silver, beating silver, raising silver into a pot, is something that is fairly common. The techniques is similar in one part of the world and another part of the world in the period that I'm studying. And so, that we have to actually start with the materials and see how they move, and see how, does their movement foster the same skills. Those skills may have entirely different meanings, entirely different symbolic meanings, entirely different social meanings, but is there some connection between skills and materials that allows the material itself to actually move knowledge? So that's what I'm working on now.
Wow. Thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.